The following podcast is taken from a live broadcast on Inspire FM.
Assalamu alaikum, and this is the Book Club Show on Inspire 105.1 FM. My name is Imrana, and it is Tuesday, the 6th of August. I hope you have had a wonderful morning so far, a good hearty breakfast. So today we have a really special show today. I have a special guest by the name of Dr. Mamnun Khan, and we will be discussing the book Being British Muslims, which, to be honest, I think is a really, really timely kind of discussion to have, especially in the current social political context and the conversations that are being had at the moment, both in Luton and actually beyond. So I'm just going to introduce actually the book itself. I'm going to read the blurb just to give you a bit of a introduction, and then after which I will introduce Dr. Khan, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. If you do have any thoughts or comments today about the topic of being British Muslims, or also after you hear some of the discussion that we're having, then obviously please call in on 01582 481 822, or you can WhatsApp in on 07779 481 822. So being British Muslims, the strapline, so to speak, is beyond ethnocentric religion and identity politics. And it says at the back, this highly thought-provoking book, packed with incisive observations and analyses on a wide range of issues facing British Muslims, offers concise yet extensive commentary on the cultural and intellectual contentions and contextualizing Islam in the UK. As of 2018, roughly 50% of the UK's Muslim population was born in the UK. With this shift comes, on one hand, the loss of old ways, in quotation marks, of experiencing the world and navigating one's place within it. And on the other hand, it comes with the excitement and opportunity to make new culture. The questions now facing British Muslims are: from where can British Muslims get their inspiration? And what should be the nature of this new culture? These questions are becoming ever more important as the UK's population is expected to grow from 5 to 10% by 2050. Thus, the author's clearly presented analysis provides critical and constructive insights for readers wanting to understand how to make faith more meaningful and relevant, going from a largely immigrant ethnocentric religion and identity politics to one formed on intelligent and confident theocentric understanding. Essential reading for anyone interested in Islam and British Muslims, including policymakers, community leaders, philanthropists and activists, as well as scholars and students of Islamic studies, sociology, cultural studies, politics, philosophy and identity. This is a most refreshing and indispensable overview of anyone interested in the area. So that is quite kind of an extensive introduction to what the book is, and hopefully I think we'll have some really interesting discussion today. And so to introduce my guest, Dr. Mamnun Khan. So Mamnun is a young social analyst, founder of grassroots initiatives, and writer whose collection of articles are interesting, insightful and pertinent. His ability to question received wisdom, analyse complex issues succinctly and offer possible solutions to the challenges facing British Muslims is refreshing and admirable. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Mamnun Khan. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me on.
This morning? Oh, thank you so much for giving us your time and to discuss this wonderful topic of being British Muslims. So my question, I guess, firstly would be, how did this book come about? Because it seems, like I said, it seems quite timely, but it obviously must have taken quite a lot of like work and thought, and to kind of come up with something like this.
Yeah, no, so it came about. Started in 2014. What happened was, up until then, I had sort of lived in my own bubble, and I'd been aware of issues in the community in Luton. Grew up in Luton, and so I've been aware of the issues, but I've never been actively involved in trying to progress any of the issues. And then in 2014, there was a group of Bangladeshi Muslims in Luton who encouraged me to kind of get more active, and that led to writing blogs. And so the blogs between 2015 and 2018, I wrote about, I think maybe about 30 to 40 blogs. It was on a blog site called Islamicate, which we've kind of taken offline now. But so the initial thinking was from the blogs, and what I found was when I looked back at it, when we stopped blogging, what I found was that the issues which I covered are actually kind of universal issues which are going to be with us for the next sort of, at least for the next 30, 50 years possibly. And so what I said, okay, let's put the blogs into a book form, let's adapt them, let's change them, let's add additional bits to it, so that actually this work can remain more in the minds of others, and they can benefit from it. So that's largely how it came about.
Sure. Okay. No, fantastic. And actually, that's so interesting, because at the moment, obviously, this idea of many people are using the platform of actually blogging to be able to get their kind of opinions across. And I think it's fantastic to actually that kind of journey from that into a book, which is really lovely to see. So now coming to the title of Being British Muslims, what is it, I guess, for a reader who's obviously not yet read the book and hopefully having heard today's show that they'll be prompted to purchase it, but what is it about the title, I guess? Is it a statement that you're making, or is it more of an action of being? I mean, where did
yeah, exactly. This whole book is a statement. It's kind of, if you look at all of the books that, pretty much all of them that have come about in the last 10 years about British Muslims, it's always been a narrative where it's not a theocentric narrative. It's not a religiously inspired narrative. What is our religion really telling us about some of these ways we do public religion, ways we embrace and then take the religion, the guidance, and then kind of try and influence society and how we project ourselves. It's largely been from the points of securitization, from the points of identity, from a kind of identity group perspective, rather than what is the religion really telling you about these things. And it's also been done from the point of view of integration. So it's those have been the kind of meta narratives which have defined a lot of the books that are out there today. And they have their pros and cons, which I encourage readers to read many of these books, because they provide a lot of good insight. But what this book tried to do is say, okay, I'm going to almost ignore all of that, and say, look, actually, there's some fundamental things that we need to be thinking about, especially because we are, my grandfather came to the Luton in 1950s, and in 1950, then my father in 1963, then we grew up here in the 80s, 90s, etc. And we're sort of in our third generation now, and we now need to be thinking about some of these things in a more strategic way, so that future generations have a better sort of understanding of Islam, and can then use the religion and the guidance it provides in order to kind of uplift and make kind of influence society so that it flourishes. Because society is really in need of this kind of what is it that God wants of us, and how do we create societies according to the Medinan model? These are very, very relevant today. And so this book tries to say, okay, there are some fundamental things that we need to be looking at, and those things are, if you look at our time here, it's largely been ethnocentric religion, and that's not necessarily a judgment. It's saying, okay, that's stating the matter of fact that that's been the case.
Could I just ask you, so for any listeners who might not quite understand the term ethnocentric, I mean, how would you define that in terms of what is it that, and especially that, and also you're saying to go beyond that. So could you try to maybe contextualize it a little bit? Yeah. So
if you look at historically, wherever Muslims have gone, they've kind of contextualized the religion according to the local nuances, the good, all the good stuff within the local cultures. So if you take, for instance, Bangladesh, for instance, Muslims have worn adapted to wear the sari, for instance, and they can wear it with their hijab intact, with their modesty intact. If you look at the language, for instance, it's not like they just speak Arabic, they speak Bengali. Similar thing for Pakistan and India, and across the world. That's always been the case, that Islam has meshed into societies in which it has found itself, and Muslims have done that. And so when we look at ourselves here, in the 1950s, we were about 100,000. We've grown to about over 3 million now, and projected to double that and become 10% of the UK population. So we're talking really significant numbers by 2050. Those are some of the projections. And what that means is we need to also ask ourselves, how do we contextualize Islam to our surroundings, so that we actually, we do what other communities have done throughout history, and this is what actually Allah and the Prophet ﷺ also, if you look at his seerah, he also encourages this, and this is what's happened all the time. So how do we do that? And ethnocentric means basically we haven't done that. We've kind of taken the religion of our fathers and our grandparents from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and kind of pretty much pasted it onto the UK without really thinking, okay, how would the religion, how would Islam be contextualized to UK conditions and situation and where we find ourselves culturally?
Sure. Okay.
Is that answer?
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. And so in terms of this, a sense that actually, obviously, as immigrants and children of immigrants, this kind of journey that I guess we all go on, because initially, I guess any kind of move from one place to another would probably require that sort of kind of pasting process. Actually, I'm just going to call it for now. So I guess it is a longer term thing, right? Because it's only probably now people maybe perhaps in our generation who've been born here, educated here, who are then able to look at the bigger picture and think, actually, how is it that we're able to now do this? Or do you think this book, for example, is probably also aimed at our parents' generation as well? Or who are you hoping would actually read this book and then take from it?
I think for the older generation, if they read this book, then what I'm saying to them is, look, there are some issues which, as the forthcoming generations live their life, they'll need to look at, and it's trying to encourage them to say, to encourage the young people to kind of embrace this kind of thinking.
Sure.
So that's for the older generation. The younger generation is saying, look, you really need to look at this stuff properly in order to be secure, to secure your generation, the next generation's future, because there's a lot of headwinds Muslims face in the UK in terms of the future of Islam, in terms of how we even understand Islam, how we, because there's we risk becoming a community where, probably one of the first communities ever where we've kind of gone into a new land, right? Found ourselves in a new land and haven't really influenced it from a theocentric point of view, from what God wants us. All previous generations and communities around the world, when they've gone to new lands, they've kind of influenced it. And if you look at, for instance, just take Pakistan or India, Bangladesh or India, look at the influence Islam has had in those countries. The language has been changed, the ethos is really embedded itself in the fabric of those societies. And that's the challenge we have, is how do we do that? Because if we really firmly believe there's goodness in what Allah says, and it's really guidance, then basically we should be thinking along these lines.
Right.
And so this book tries to look at the contentions. So it says, okay, what are those things which kind of we need to sort of solve and kind of do slightly differently, or think about it slightly differently in order to unlock our theocentric potential. That's what it looks at.
Sure. Okay. And then, so how is it? I mean, I like the term that you're using, this idea of actually being able to have influence. And I guess my question would be, in what ways are we able to actually, understand whether or not that's happening? So, for example, you've got a chapter in your book which is called Integration, Identity, Politics, and obviously there's a lot of discussion about the idea of identity and how that plays out, especially specifically as South Asian Muslims in the UK. Now, because obviously now integration is a term that's become extremely loaded, recently. Only this morning I read an article about the situation in Kashmir, and how obviously what the government's doing, and it's at one point there was something in that article that said that they're just trying to instill kind of integration into this particular area. Now, in living in a country where sometimes that term is used as a smokescreen for actually what they want is assimilation, how do we navigate that as British Muslims, knowing that actually it's not necessarily integration that people want, but also secondly, maybe we are already influencing certain things, but it's maybe more subtle than we realize? I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I think you've got a point there. We are. It's not like it's not a 0 or 1 kind of binary situation. We are influencing society as we speak. So what this book tries to do is say, okay, there's some contentions in how we approach religion, and if we look at those things, then actually we can really define what integration should be for the UK. Okay. And we can talk about it in a language and in a way which kind of inspires others. So at the moment, it's very kind of offstandish. Some sections are offstandish, some sections are of the Muslim community, some are kind of very want to kind of demote the role of religion because they fear X, Y, and Z. You've got all of these different voices. What I'm saying is, put that to a side. Let's actually really define the narrative from looking at what is it that the Quran and the Sunnah and prophetic life and scholarship has actually taught us about some of these things. And then what we'll find there is a renewed way of looking at the whole problem. And it's a bit like, when I was at work, someone asked, I was having a discussion with someone, and she's a really intelligent person, non-Muslim. She was asking me, okay, good and bad, can be defined by human beings. And I said, and so she was kind of saying that to kind of say, okay, implying that we don't need religion.
Sure.
So I then said, okay, actually, you do have a point there, because in the Islamic tradition, we have a theological group called the Maturidi tradition, which basically says that to an extent, human beings are capable of defining and understanding and recognizing good and bad. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that in the Quran. There's an ayat which refers to it. And so when I said that back to her, she said, oh wow. And it completely changed her thinking.
Sure.
Because suddenly she got something which actually showed, okay, it's not the usual narrative, it's something different. And you could do that because you understand and you've learned religion and you know what the discussion points are, and it allows you to kind of engage in a more meaningful and more inspiring way. And that's what this book tries to do, is say, okay, if we really understand some of these things, then we can really inspire society in a different way than we're maybe accustomed to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then, I mean, what I really loved is how that you started off I think it's literally maybe the first chapter. Yes. So it's called Faith, Reason and Progress. But this idea about questioning and how important it is actually to always be questioning in terms of when it comes to our learning. But I guess then my question would be, for young people potentially, or even people in our generation who are children of kind of immigrants and who are born and bred here, what are the questions that you think that we should be asking in terms of our place in society here?
Yeah, I think so. At the back of the book, I've tried to summarize some of the I've kind of proposed a charter, I feel like, for British Muslims, and I've said, okay, there are 7 points in there that if we approach almost anything with those 7 points in mind, then actually, we could be setting ourselves to a different path. And it's things like, gaining contextualized and deeper knowledge of how to be godly. So we all talk about religion, but how do you be religious? And in different contexts, and you might find a very particularly difficult situation versus an easy situation versus a new situation. How are we to be godly? Right? Do we have the knowledge to kind of say, okay, yes, I think my religion is telling me to do this, and I think Allah, these are the examples, or which kind of inspires me to do certain things. So that's kind of one. Yeah. There's like that, things like valuing the power of the intellect and deep thinking. You mentioned about questioning, learning through questioning. Well, if you look at in the Indian subcontinent, the way largely religion is done is basically you just accept someone of a high authority, an imam, a scholar. They do they teach you, and you sort of accept it. But actually, that's not how scholarship has really been done throughout history. And we shouldn't just paste that into the UK. Sure. We need to question and learn by questioning. And that's not to say, okay, we deconstruct everything. No, we question in order to understand things. And if something is really of a truthful and sound nature, then you'll be able to figure that out. And by questioning, you'll gain a deeper understanding. So it's kind of, even the second point, valuing the power of intellect and deep thinking. We need to kind of value these things. It's like religion is supposed to make you think deeper and go beyond what might be apparent. And the third thing is, okay if I just go through some of these.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure.
Third one is establishing reputable institutes of learning, platforms and standards. So if you like, we need to be creating institutes which actually, give us give us the platforms and standards and learning that we need. So I talked to a lot of, as part of this book, I've got in touch with a lot of people around the UK, and for instance, a Muslim college in London. One of the things they tell me is actually Muslims aren't investing in Islamic learning, despite all of the discussions and all of the our religion is being attacked and etc. Muslims aren't actually investing in religious institutes, and we need to do that. We need to do that in order to teach religion properly. Platforms and standards. Standards. We haven't. We haven't really defined this a standard for mosque curricula, for instance. There's so many different ones out there, and there are pros and cons for all of them. But wouldn't it be great if we say, okay, this is kind of a syllabus, a curricula that kids up to GCSE will follow, and they'll get a GCSE at the end of it as well. And all the maktabs in the UK follow this, and actually, and these are some of the subjects they'll cover, and these are some of the grades they'll have. It's standards, setting standards, because if we're to do these things on a long-term basis, we need to create these standards. And then also platforms. We have there are platforms that come about out of people's own eagerness to kind of help and do things, and that's great. All we need to be doing is supporting that, and and they all have make their mistakes, and not to kind of either prejudge them or put them down when they've made a mistake, but to kind of have a bit of patience and kind of help them. So these are kind of some of the things that we need to be establishing. Number 4, seeking to be a type of total Muslim with a God-centered ethic. What does that mean? And I kind of define that, in a bit more detail in the book. Number 5, taking care in social interactions. How do we take care in social interaction? This is massive. There's a chapter there. It's called Al-Adab Al-Internet. This is an area where scholars haven't, and this isn't a criticism of scholars, but the fact is that we haven't really defined a fiqh of mu'asharat, mu'amalat in terms of for the modern world. Things like how do we engage online, right? In terms of what are the adabic principles we should be teaching everybody. You come across articles here and there, but nothing substantial work has been done. And whereas throughout history, people have always looked at, okay, this is how you do adab, right? And so
I think that's quite an interesting point, actually, which we can maybe discuss a bit more after the break. This idea of actually in the current context and social media and how things play out there. So we are discussing Being British Muslims by Dr. Mamnun Khan. Join us in a few moments after the break. Assalamu alaikum.
You're listening to an Inspire FM podcast, making available our popular programs from our daily broadcast on Inspire FM.
I was just astonished because this is the book club show Inspire 105.1 FM. The reason I just kind of done that is because that advert just before the break on about the Inspire Eid really did make me laugh. I think it's wonderful. Just so it will be happening at Lucy Park in Luton on 11th and 12th of August between 12 and 8 p.m. So I hope to see you all there. Right, so today's book for the book club show, we are discussing Being British Muslims by Dr. Mamnun Khan. So basically discussing beyond ethnocentric religion and identity politics. Just before the break, we were talking a little bit, actually, Dr. Khan was talking about this idea of almost having this concept of having other online, which sometimes is a big challenge at the moment. And actually, I thought that'd be interesting conversation now to have in our current context, where a lot of us perhaps do spend time on social media, where we might be actually discussing various things, including politics, including so many different things that actually that gives us a platform to discuss. But yeah, so Dr. Khan, so we were just talking a little bit about that, actually, this kind of idea of what it means to be in social media and how we interact as Muslims. So would you want to speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important topic, because I think there's some stats in the book which actually tells us how long we spend online, and we're talking about hours. And I think I calculated in the book about at the current sort of rate, if we do that throughout our lifetime, then it could amount to about 11 years.
Wow, amazing!
That's astonishing. And so, if we're spending so much time on social media, what does that mean? How do we engage and do it properly? And what is it that the religion teaches, and so on. And so actually this, and so just before I talk about that, there's another thing here which is about information. This is known as the information age, because information is everywhere. People are collecting data, we're collecting data, we're data informed, data driven, etc., etc. So it's all about information. So, but this actually, if you look historically, this isn't the only time Muslims have faced this. And we can learn a lot from historically when Muslims face a barrage of information, new information. How did they engage that? How did they assimilate that and sort that out and synthesize new information? So if you look at in medieval times, just after just at the beginning of the of the classical period, Muslims faced, there was all, as Islam expanded, you had new philosophies, new ideas, new thinking came about. And that actually challenged Muslims a lot. And so how did they engage that, and how did they sort that out? So there's historical precedence to this as well. So I mean, today, because of the information age, we're bombarded with all sorts of information. How do we engage that? I think one of the things that we need to actually, before we engage that, we need to kind of learn about is the adab we use in order to engage that. And there's a chapter on this on page 85, which actually goes through some of the principles that we actually need to be mindful of before we engage this area. And it's things like firstly beginning, and it's nothing kind of out of the world, what I'm proposing. The first point I'm making here is actually in the ilm, the knowledge of the adab of the internet, right, should begin with having correct intention. This is basic. This is one of the most basic principles we have in our religion, is having the correct intention. And what that means is, we have good intentions, we have sincerity, and we begin with God in mind. And if we do that, then actually what we'll immediately find is, instead of maybe poking fun at somebody, we'll straight away be cognizant that Allah is ever watchful. So this will help us. The second point I'm saying is kind of fact checking. There's a kind of a tendency in all of us, and we've all done it, and I've certainly done it, is just kind of forwarding and sharing things which without really fact checking it. And there's some techniques we can use. It's called the 4 gates of speech, which basically says before you share things, you kind of ask yourself, is it true? Second question is it necessary? Third question is it kind? Fourth question is it the right time? And if none of those things are right, because sometimes, it's so important, right? We go in the middle of a discussion, and I do it, we all do it. We go into the middle of a discussion two people are having with something which we think is relevant, but actually it wasn't our discussion to go into. So is it the right time to do that? The third point is, even if information is factually correct, we need to think critically about whether it will be of a benefit to others. Okay, and so this is, for instance, sometimes you can have haqq, you can have the truth on you, but actually it's completely the wrong time, wrong place to kind of bring it. So if, for instance, if two people are having an argument, and if you say, if you then bring in religion, and they're both anti-religionists, what's going to happen? Yeah, it's obvious they're just going to gang up on you together. So we haven't really helped the situation. So it's talking about time. The other thing is, the fourth point is, we shouldn't concern ourselves with something which doesn't really concern us. There's a tendency with the information age is, because everything meets everything, we kind of think, okay, that's really relevant, and I need to engage with it. But actually it doesn't. It doesn't. Most things don't really concern us. And even if they concern us, do we have the influencing capacity to do anything with it, or to add something of value or benefit? And one of the principles, the charters at the back of the book, is adding value to actions, to our actions. So this is actually important. Another important point. Number 5, avoid sharing bad news stories from far places. It's completely out of context. What tends to happen is, we sort of think, okay, we live in the West, okay, and the West is a massive place. So all of Americas, Canada, America, Australia, Western Europe, and kind of we bring stories from those places, and kind of say, okay, well, this Muslim was attacked in Texas, and yes, I mean, they were attacked, but there's a tendency that we because we bring these bad news stories from all around the world, it almost feels like the world is falling on us.
I guess that's quite an interesting point, because it is this, as you said, in the information age, that the global becomes local. And I guess, I see your point, because it's almost inevitable that actually, because of all the information that's going around, that we are always exposed to it. Actually, Baraka Blue, he once wrote, who's a spoken word poet and rapper based in America. He once wrote, it was an article or a blog, and he called it it's gone out of my head, something about the tragedy. I'll have to look it up. But the point he was making was actually that we always almost overexposed to all the negative and bad things that are kind of happening in the world. That actually we're not designed in a way to be able to deal with that much kind of, horror and all kind of the negative things. But I guess my other point though would be to maybe slightly interrogate that. So if we have those platforms, so I'm thinking primarily of something on Twitter, where there tends to be a bit more kind of political discourse happening on there. If we don't discuss issues that are happening globally from a Muslim point of view, then how can we actually explore what it means to be Muslim in the 21st century, just in the world? I mean, you're right, maybe we should always start in the UK, but actually it's actually a problem right now in terms of how Muslims are being persecuted across the world. Is something we have to also recognize and talk about, surely.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, that one, and it's not, these things don't have easy solutions, because in some things you actually, unless you you kind of shout about it, nothing will ever get done. So there are some nuances we need to have here. It's in some things, yes, we have to adapt things. So there's no one size fits all for this. But what I'm kind of trying to make the point is that there are principles out there which, if we understood and if we kind of live by those principles, then we might just get a better result at the end of it. And it's kind of trying to instill, encourage that discussion. What are these principles? And if we have those, then we might be able to wade through, okay, what is more pertinent to speak about rather than what isn't, what is just kind of tangential, and it's kind of a journalist is just making a point which like other journalists, they're interested in making a point because of what they do in their jobs, and it's not necessarily that pertinent to us as Muslims or to society at large. We just need to ignore that. So it's kind of those kind of things that we need to, how do we call that out? How do we look at that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for our listeners who maybe have just joined us, we are discussing today Being British Muslims, Beyond Ethnocentric Religion and Identity Politics by Dr. Mamnun Khan, who is in the studio with me at the moment. So we're just having a bit of a discussion about what does it actually mean to be British Muslim in our current context, especially in the UK, and I guess more specifically in Luton. Now you have one of the chapters here is called Why Language and Labels Matter, which I thought was quite interesting actually to read, because this is something for myself I guess as a teacher, but also working in the arts, where there are certain labels that sometimes imposed on particularly kind of, I guess, South Asian communities. So Luton is an area, for example, which has been highlighted as having a low engagement with the arts. And it's a term that, which is tend to use something like hard to reach communities, which I'm also always interrogating, because I think it depends how you define art and, if you even recognize the creativity which already exists, right? So that's a conversation I'm always having. So this idea of labels I do find interesting. So in that chapter, and actually it links nicely onto a different chapter where you're talking about Islamophobia, so I'm going to try to link those both together if I can. So in this particular paragraph, I'm just going to read it out quickly. It says, similarly, in the struggle for social justice, so it's on page 19, similarly, in the struggle for social justice, many activists are trigger happy in the use of the term white power without distinguishing hard right or white supremacy from, say, casual or institutional racism. In such popular discourses, use of such terms isn't usually in context, but rather used in a cursing mode, in angry, predatory, amplified voices so that they can be heard. Yet most white people don't have the foggiest idea of what this label actually means, nor are they responsible for what they're being accused of historically or today. So being white in a generalized way becomes wrongly cognate of injustice, just like being black was once cognate of being fit for enslavement by Europeans. And then actually I might just get to the end of it. So oddly, those who use such shorthand labels are often quick to point out that the term Islamist terrorism is a contradiction in terms, yet only too happy to use shorthand labels when venting their own frustrations. So that was kind of really, I guess, packed for me, because I was thinking that there's definitely a point there, again, coming to the idea of how we sometimes can be reactionary and some of the discussions that we have. But then also this idea that, we're talking about white supremacy. When we talk about white power, for example, that you've used, we're talking about systems, aren't we? And then because you make the point that, we're people potentially accusing white people, for example, of something that's happened historically. But so this idea, especially, I guess, ourselves as South Asians, when we talk about, post-colonial discourse, surely it's actually quite important to obviously not be reactionary in the way we discuss those things. But when we do talk about white supremacy, or we use the term white people, which people get very easily offended by, now how do we navigate that conversation then without kind of putting the onus on just one community, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. What this book is trying to do is say, okay, how would the Prophet ﷺ would have approached this, and are there examples like that? And what we find is there are many examples like that,
Sure.
and what at a kind of summary level, what the Prophet, the way he normally engaged that was, he didn't want to offend the other people.
Sure.
So he was, he was very mindful of not portraying this kind of harsh sort of thing back, which maybe he was at the receiving it, facing it.
Sure.
So I think that there's an important sort of principle here, is how do we shift the paradigm in which we engage some of these things? Okay, so if we know that in history, people, colonialism and colonialists, they put terms out there in order to divide and subdivide and those kind of things. What we need to do is not do that in return. So because actually that is prophetic. The Prophet was attacked, and he also prevented other companions from actually reacting in harshly, hastily. And so that's an important principle we need to bear in mind. And so when it comes to kind of talking about white supremacy, it's very, very topical, with kind of what's happened in America very recently. I think it's worth recognizing that, should we be talking the same language? And is there a nuance we can use in that language which will kind of inspire people? Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is give people another way of looking at it, so that it changes them. Because there's a lot of psychological evidence, for instance, which says that if you constantly attack people, constantly kind of pointing their negatives, then they're just going to go away. They're just going to walk away. And this is actually, there's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that, had you been, and paraphrasing, had you been harsh in your language, he's saying that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then they would have gone away. Right? There's some principles here that we need to be mindful of. What tends to happen is a lot of people use this as I said, in a derogatory kind of way, but failing to realize that these are human beings as well. And what we need to show is that actually these are fallible human beings which have these issues, which we need to help them and kind of make them feel like we're helping them. And these are tough. It's not easy when you've got a lot of pressure. The media and politicians are saying them. This is tough, but we have guidance, right? Yes, that's what I'm trying to say, is we have guidance. We need to be looking at guidance and informing us.
No, I guess, no, definitely, I agree with that point. I think, but this notion of being able to recognize the other is kind of also being human. I think, sure, if that had been the case, I guess, for the colonialists, then actually colonialism would never have been a problem, because they would recognize the other as actually also being human and not being so completely dehumanizing them, which is, I think, is interesting discourse. But I think at the moment, I mean, there might be some of the listeners out there. As part of a project that I did called Echoes of the Diaspora, I did a spoken word film called Sticks and Stones, and I guess it's interesting for me because that is something I also thought about. That the things that I'm saying, they could come across as quite harsh, to be quite frank, white people potentially. But then it was also me having this conversation about myself and me being able to be comfortable enough in my own skin to be able to say this is how I felt, this is how I feel. And actually, my intention is not to offend. It is just to actually, after all those years of being or attempting to be palatable, that actually maybe this is not the time. And I think into like what you've just mentioned, what's happening in America, again, obviously it's politics that's happening over there, but it's affecting us definitely over here, from especially now with our new Prime Minister, which actually probably brings me nicely along to your chapter on Islamophobia. So when we have a Prime Minister who will label Muslim women who wear niqab as letterboxes, which is obviously just one example. Now, in your chapter, actually, my first question would really be that, so your chapter is called The Trouble with Islamophobia 20 Years On. My first question is, why is the word Islamophobia in quotation marks? Because I'm just thinking, are you using it as a term because it's a term that's just kind of come about, or is it because you're questioning the very label?
No, I'm not questioning the phenomena. Phenomena is, we know we are, there's this thing called Islamophobia, and people face disadvantages and accusations and hostility against them because of their religion. That's a fact. There's lots of studies and lots of data being collected for that, and that's growing. So it's not really questioning that. What it's saying is, this thing about language and terms we're using. If Islam is telling us, not Islam, but when we read the Quran, and what is Allah is telling us to think deeper. To ponder about things, and so we should be taking that kind of approach to everything, right? So Islamophobia as a term is actually one of those where, if we look at the word Islam and phobia, what we've actually done there is people say Islamophobia, but what they actually mean is Muslim. Sure. Right, is Muslim, because the Islamophobia is being addressed to a Muslim, not necessary to the religion. Sure. Because usually when this religion is quite clear that they're criticizing religion. So then we get into, okay, so why do we have this term? And if we look at other terms like Jewish phobia, that doesn't exist, right? Sure. Or even if you look at homophobia, homo is kind of you're directing at the person, not necessarily to the concept. Sure. At a kind of a superficial level. So it's really saying, okay, we now, and that's why we need to that's why there's been over years and years of trying to define this thing, right? And over the last few years, there's been lots of attempts. Sure. Firstly by the Runnymede Trust, which kind of coined this term 21 years ago. And more recently, the APPG on British Muslims, they try to come up with a definition which has had a lot of backing by Muslim organizations and Muslim individuals. And now the government have said, okay, actually that's too vague, and they've appointed Imam Qari Asim to kind of to lead that. Sure. To redefine it. So all these definitions, right? And that chapter is actually telling it kind of goes through some of the challenges of this area. And it kind of says, okay, if we were doing this from a problem solving perspective, and there's a chapter on how do we problem solving and lean problem solving, how the prophets did it and how we can learn from that, is in sort of what this definition I've tried to do is kind of boil all of the different facets to Muslims in the UK into one definition. Of they've kind of Runnymede Trust will kind of do that because their raison d'etre is kind of saying that racism is massive and we need to fix it, and that's their philosophy, and that's why the perspective will be slightly different, it'll be broader. That's why any definition which they propose would kind of tend to have those elements in it. So we have in the Muslims sort of have this experience where you can divide into 4 different chunks, as I see it. One is kind of all the negative portrayals in the media, all of the bias and all that kind of stuff in the media. Then you've got Then you've got a kind of a societal bias where society doesn't really value religion much in the UK and in the Western world. There's lots of studies on this. I think there was 11% of the UK population. There was a study done by Pew Research. 11% of the UK population actually valued religion. So actually, that has an important consequence on us, right? So we need to be mindful of that. Then there's another section around all of the points around socio-demographic and class and the challenges of social mobility. That's kind of another bracket. And then you've got another bracket here, which kind of the book tries to deal with, is all of the contentions within the Muslim community. So what Islamophobia, the definitions of Islamophobia does is kind of, it marries a lot of these things in a way which hasn't been really properly thought about in the layers.
Sure.
Right, and that's why even if you have a definition that everyone agrees to, it's going to cause a lot of issues. So what that chapter does actually say, if we can go down that route and actually not fix the problem and make it worse, potentially, which is what I'm arguing, or we can say, okay, let's look at the basic definition, which actually firstly, we don't confuse all of these issues, and secondly, most people will actually agree to.
Sure.
And so what is that label, what is that definition, and should be using it? And what I'm proposing in the book is that we should be using the word anti-Muslim hatred. That's not going to address your social mobility issues.
Sure.
That needs to be addressed, but we shouldn't at this stage bringing that into the fold, because actually we'll just find there's loads of problems everywhere, and we're trying to use one definition to kind of have a way into all of these problems.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is quite a deeper, I guess, kind of conversation to have, because on one hand, I guess partly some of my feeling is actually just to have some sort of definition would be helpful in kind of the current climate as it is, because it helps. I think it does really help to have an anchor where that you can go to and say, actually, this is what the issue is. This is what I've experienced. But I guess at the same time, this idea of the definition of perceived Muslimness and linking it to racism. And again, I guess I just come back to this idea that and you mentioned it in the book that once upon a time, this kind of racism would have been. It would have been because of the colour of skin, being called, go home Paki, or, something like that. But then I guess post 9/11, it's then come into this idea of actually it's our identity as Muslims, and that's what's being attacked. I
think actually, just on that point, I think it's a really valid point you've kind of raised there. So what's happened is, if you look at 10, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago even, we used to define ourselves as British Pakistanis, British Bangladeshi, British Indians, whatever, British Arabs, and British Somalis, and so we did that. Government used to kind of collect data on that, and also when we go and work for companies, they ask you which ethnicity you are, and you kind of tick that. Yes. So now what's happened is, fast forward to now, we've suddenly called ourselves British Muslims, but actually when we look at how we're still ethnically rooted in our communities, we're still doing ethnocentric religion, and we're still doing internal identity politics. So how do we move the forward? So what do we need to become British Muslims properly? Muslims in a sense where we don't have ethnocentric religion, and we don't do identity politics, and we're more reliant on what a theocentric God, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us, and informed from religious principles and scholarship and those kind of things. Sure. This is what this book is only about.
Yeah. No, and I think that's wonderful actually point to kind of end on this. What does it mean to actually be a British Muslim, and how actually we always come back to Allah in all that we do, and the intentions come back to this idea of always having the intentions to benefit the communities in which we live. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. My thanks to Dr. Mamnun Khan, and I will hopefully see you back in a couple of weeks. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Why not tune in to our live stream at inspirefm.org and follow and subscribe to our social media platforms at InspireFM Luton.